All right, guys, well, if you've been with us thus far, then you remember that we've now covered 4 arguments for the existence of God. Now, I just want to let you know there's at least 24 arguments for God's existence. And I was very merciful, and I only shared 4 with you. And so we looked at the cosmological argument and seeing the beginning of the universe, there's a cosmic creator. We looked at the design argument, seeing the fine-tuning and design of the human body, there's an intelligent designer. We looked at the conceptual argument, and we see that there's eternal ideas. In reality, there must be therefore an eternal mind. And there is the moral argument, and good and evil, objective moral values are real, and therefore God is real because he is the anchor, he is the source of objective moral values. So we have answered the most foundational and central question that any human needs to answer. Does God exist? And the answer is a loud and resounding yes, because the evidence is just sky high, mountains of evidence that points powerfully and persuasively to God's existence. But the second question now becomes this: what kind of God exists? What kind of God? So as we looked at the 3 different arguments, we know the type of qualities and characteristics that God must have. If you have a cell phone, you could go ahead and silence that. We know the type of qualities and characteristics that this creator must have. It, by default, it rules out Hinduism. It rules out Buddhism, Zen, Shintoism, polytheism, because those kinds of ideas are not reflected in reality based upon the evidence. The only 3 options, the only live options on the table are perhaps the God of Islam, the God of Judaism, or the God of the Old and New Testament, the God of Christianity. So we're going to answer the second question now, what kind of God exists, by just making a beeline directly for the Bible. Now we know that God exists, and so if you take a person on this intellectual journey and you have this discussion with them, now you want to transition into a new phase, and you're going to say, now we know that God exists, and I want to propose to you that we examine the Old and New Testament, because this is the God that is reflected from all of the evidence. And so now, for the remainder of today, we're going to share with you 3 evidences that prove to you that the Bible is indeed God's Word. So we're going to now narrow our focus. Now we've established that God exists, and now the next level is we are going to proclaim that it is the Christian God and the Christian God only that exists. But to do that, we have to first examine the Bible. So we're going to do 3 things in our time remaining today. First of all, right now, we're going to examine the biblical manuscripts. Then after that, we're going to examine the archaeology and history behind the Bible. And thirdly, then we're going to examine the divine signature on the Bible. And here's the reason why we have to do it in this order. First of all, you need to know, and the person you're talking with, they need to know that the Bible is a trustworthy historical book. Maybe the Bible has changed. Maybe the manuscript copies have gotten perverted or twisted or corrupted, as many atheists like Bart Ehrman, the PhD New Testament atheist scholar, says. So we have to examine the manuscripts to see if it's trustworthy. But then we have to examine the archaeology and history to see if it's reliable. Can we trust this book as it relates to explaining historical events and so forth? And then, if it passes the test of being a trustworthy ancient book, then we go to that third level, and we're going to look for a divine signature that shows us unmistakably that the Bible is inspired of God. So you understand? So first of all, we're going to establish it as a rock-solid historical ancient book, and then we're going to show that it was a book inspired of God. Make sense? And then tomorrow evening, which hopefully you'll come back from 6 to 9, we're going to narrow our focus even further to the person of Jesus. So let's jump into this. First of all, as I said, we're going to examine the Old Testament manuscripts. Can we trust them? Can we trust the manuscripts of the Bible in general, of the Old Testament? And as I said, to ease us into this topic, as we've been doing for you, let's examine a video, and it's going to give you some exposure as to the manuscript evidence of the Bible that you hold in your hands.
I actually believe the Bible for many reasons, but for me, one of the crucial issues is the actual manuscript availability that we find within the sources. My understanding is that a historical source is only as good as the documents that it sits upon. And the evidence for the New Testament documents is extremely strong, particularly when you compare the source material for the secular sources of the time. Two of the earliest biographies of Alexander the Great, for example, are written 400 years or so after his death by Arrian and by Plutarch, are considered by historians to be the strongest evidence for his life. And yet we're still finding them 400 or 500 years after he died in 323 BC. And yet for me the remarkable thing is that historians are still prepared to treat this as a key source document. And the same is true for some of the lateness of the manuscripts. If you take, for example, the Annals of Tacitus, written maybe 100 or 110 AD, the earliest available manuscript for him is not found until 850 AD. It's the same for the letters of Pliny, it's the same for the lives of Suetonius. The Bible manuscript evidence is much more compelling than some of the secular sources. If you take the earliest surviving codices of the New Testament, Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus, they both date from around about the middle of the 4th century AD. Now that immediately closes the window on the sources to a much shorter period than, for example, the Annals of Tacitus or the works of Pliny. And we can even push it further than that. If you take the earliest surviving manuscript fragment, which is one of the Rylands papyri held in the John Rylands Library in Manchester, we actually find that there's an early fragment of the Gospel of John. It contains just a few verses from John chapter 18. And it was found in Egypt, and historians have dated it to around about 125 or 130 AD. Now, even the most liberal scholars will tell you that John, the Gospel writer, John the Apostle, died in the AD 90s, or perhaps as late as AD 100. So when you consider that this Gospel fragment of his is available 25 or 30 years after that, we get this remarkable piece of evidence that the scribe who was perhaps recording the fragment that we have was alive at the time that John the writer himself was alive. In other words, what the document does is take us right to the very heartbeat of the Gospel message, and it gives us something really significant to work with. Now you can add to this the number of manuscript copies which are still available. There are 8 copies, for example, for Herodotus, one of the so-called fathers of history. There's 7 copies of some of Aristotle's work. There's 20 copies left of Tacitus. And yet there's somewhere between 20,000 and 24,000 New Testament documents or New Testament fragments surviving. I suppose really the bottom line is this. The biographer of Jesus, who takes a look at the Gospel records as recorded in the New Testament, is on much safer ground and much surer ground than the biographer of, for example, Julius Caesar, or Alexander the Great, or Pliny the Younger. And I don't hear anybody arguing the evidence for their existence at any point in time. For me, the New Testament manuscript evidence is compelling enough, but if you add to that the most remarkable archaeological discovery of the 20th century, it seems that both the Old Testament and the New Testament documents stand up to scrutiny. Back in 1947, an Arab goat herder near Qumran, around the area of the Dead Sea, threw a stone into a cave, and he heard a strange noise. So he went to investigate and found in the cave and in caves nearby a variety of clay jars, and in the jars were leather documents. And what he didn't realise at the time, but what archaeologists and historians have later discovered, is that he had found what's become known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, the most incredible manuscript discovery of the 20th century. The Dead Sea Scrolls have been dated to around about 100 BC. They're the most convincing and most complete record that we have of both Old Testament and New Testament manuscripts. It seems that there were some monastic farmers living around the area in the 1st century AD, and when the Romans took Jerusalem in AD 70, they tried to hide their manuscripts and hide their documents in these jars in the caves. One of the scrolls contains all 66 chapters of the book of Isaiah. And it's remarkable because it also antedates the previous oldest copy of the book of Isaiah by nearly 1,000 years. The Masoretic text was around 900 or 1,000 AD. This Dead Sea Scrolls copy is from around 100 BC. Normally you'd expect remarkable changes in a document over 1,000 years. That's a pretty long period of time. And yet what's remarkable for scholars of the Dead Sea Scrolls is that that copy of Isaiah found in the caves in Qumran is virtually identical to the later Masoretic copy that dates from 900 or 1000 AD. You would expect to find many more changes than you do, and even the changes and the variations which are there are pretty negligible. They certainly don't impact on anything central to the Gospel or central to Isaiah's message. I spent a lot of time working with old manuscripts and working with old books, and it seems to me that the Bible more than passes the tests that historians lay down when they work with ancient source material. And I find that that means that when I come to the Bible, or when anyone else comes to the Bible, they can treat it not merely as a book of old documents, a book of old manuscripts, but as something living and powerful, containing a message for us today.
So this question of the manuscripts of the Bible is very important because you need to have a personal understanding and conviction as a Christian that you can trust the documents that you're reading. And so you may not be familiar with this topic. You may not have learned much about this, but the manuscript evidence is very, very important. So in terms of the Old Testament, I want to cover with you two things about the manuscripts of the Old Testament. Number one, the quantity, and number two, the quality of the Old Testament manuscripts. And what I'm going to propose for you, and what I want you to remember, just those two simple words, is that the Old Testament is the greatest ancient historical document that we have. Why? Because it possesses the greatest quantity and the greatest quality of manuscripts in the ancient world. It's that simple. It is the greatest ancient manuscript by virtue of the fact that we have the greatest quantity of manuscripts and the greatest quality. So let's jump into this. Number one, the quantity of Old Testament manuscripts. Now, as he made reference to, the quantity of Old Testament manuscripts is very impressive. We have about 10,000 Old Testament manuscripts, which is a very, very high number. Most ancient books, as you saw in the video, maybe 7, maybe 8. One of the books that is the highest of non-Christian material is Homer's Iliad, which has about 600 copies. But yet the Old Testament simply blows that away with 10,000 manuscripts, and they date, as you can see there, from 250 BC to 11 AD. Let me show you some of the examples of the Old Testament manuscripts that we have in possession in the world. There's a manuscript called Oriental 4445. It dates from 820 to 850. It has the books of Genesis all the way up to Deuteronomy, and it's housed in the British Museum. We also have Codex Kyrensis. This is dated from AD 895. It has the former and the latter prophets. It's found in Egypt. They have a picture of that to go along with it. There's the Aleppo Codex. It's dated from AD 930. The Aleppo Codex contains the entire New Testament, and it's housed in Hebrew University. There's a picture of it. And also Codex Leningradensis. As you can tell, it's housed in Russia. It has a complete Old Testament manuscript, and it's the basis for the Hebrew Bible. We also have Codex Geniza. This is in Egypt in a storehouse, and it's located throughout the world, and the date for that is 929 to 1121 AD. So numerous manuscripts, and those are certainly old and they're ancient, but if you paid attention to the dates, a lot of them are in the AD years. They're Old Testament manuscripts, but they're dated in AD. And as you heard in the video, in 1947, the greatest archaeological discovery happened in the 20th century because there was a father, and he was out with his son, and they were goat farmers. And the boy, never take for granted what God can do through little kids. The boy took a rock, and he threw it at a goat, and he missed. Thank God he missed. And the rock went into a cave, and they heard a sound of breaking glass. And breaking clay. And upon investigation, this man found multitudes of these clay jars, and within these jars is what has come to be called the Dead Sea Scrolls, the greatest manuscript discovery of the 20th century, and one of the most important biblical discoveries in history. An absolutely wonderful, wonderful discovery. The location where it was found is the Qumran area, and the really great value of this, these manuscripts are 1,000 years older than any other manuscript we had before 1947. And so you see, the argument before 1947 with the Dead Sea Scrolls, the argument was this: your biblical manuscripts are not that old. How do we know that it hasn't changed over the last couple centuries before that, or the millennia before that? And this is where the Dead Sea Scrolls come to our rescue. Within the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's many different fragments and many different scrolls. You have the Paleo-Exodus from 250 BC, the Samuel fragment from 225 BC, the Leviticus scroll from the 2nd century BC, the Hosea scroll from 1st century BC, and the entire book of Isaiah, all 66 chapters, it goes back to 100 BC. I've actually seen these scrolls myself. They are housed in Israel in the dome of the scrolls, and the roof of the building is shaped like the lid of the clay pots in which these manuscripts were found. It's one of the most priceless national treasures that Israel possesses to this day. And essentially, as I said, they date the Dead Sea Scrolls in a lot of different ways, but basically they date back to about 250 BC, and they are 1,000 years older than the previous manuscripts. So there's a lot of manuscripts that we have, about 10,000 manuscripts of the Old Testament, and that is their quantity. It is without comparison in ancient books. So the Old Testament is great in terms of its quantity. Now let's move into its quality. The quality of the manuscripts of the Old Testament, their quality and accuracy is known from several different practices. In other words, now that we have all these manuscript copies, and especially since we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, which go back 1,000 years earlier, we can compare all the manuscripts with each other. We can compare the manuscripts with what we have today in our modern Old Testament Bibles, and we can understand their accuracy. Number one, we can compare the Greek Septuagint translation of the Old Testament. You see, because Alexander the Great conquered the world around 300 BC, the Greek language spread all over the world, including Israel. And so the common person in Israel in those days spoke Greek, just like Paul did, just like Peter, just like Jesus did. They also spoke Aramaic, but in addition, Greek. And so what they did is they translated the entire 39 books of the Old Testament into Greek, because everybody spoke Greek. The only people that really spoke Hebrew were the religious people. It would be like a Roman Catholic priest speaking Latin. He only does that because he's a religious professional. And so in these days in Israel, around the time of Jesus, the common man on the street spoke Greek. So they translated the Old Testament into Greek, and it's called the Septuagint translation. 70 scholars translated it, and that's what that symbol stands for, LXX. That's the Roman numeral for 70. And so the Septuagint translation goes back to about 250 BC, and we can compare it with what we have today. And the accuracy of the Old Testament is incredibly high. Number two, we know the quality and accuracy of the Old Testament manuscripts because the Jewish scribes, the men who it was their life's work, it was their job, it was their duty to copy the Old Testament manuscripts, we know how seriously they took their job. They believed that they were translating and that they were copying the Word of God. And they took their job very seriously. As a matter of fact, we have a slide for you to show you their practices. The 10 rules of the scribe. Rule number 1, ritual cleansing and bathing before writing the name of God. The name of God appears over 7,000 times in the Old Testament. Every time before they would write those 4 letters, YHVH, they would take a ritual cleansing and a bath. They were some squeaky clean dudes. Number 2, they must ignore all conversation if writing God's name. Number 3, no copying from memory. They must have a manuscript. Number 4, the scrolls had to have equal amounts of columns. Number 5, the letters and the columns were counted. Did you hear that? They knew the number of A's on the page, the numbers of M's on the page. They counted the letters and the columns in their manuscripts. Parchment and papyrus must be lined before starting. Each column must extend downward 48 to 60 lines. The scribe was dressed in full Jewish attire. Old or errant copies of the scripture were ritually destroyed. And finally, they had to be aware of the conscious presence of God. So did they take their job very seriously? Yes, and this is one of the reasons that we can be very confident of the quality and accuracy of the Old Testament manuscripts. A third way that we know the accuracy is by comparing parallel passages. There are passages in the Bible that come from different books, different authors, different time periods, but they're the same quote. They're a parallel passage, and by comparing them, you can deduce accuracy. Number 4, the large number of Hebrew manuscripts. Again, it's 10,000 manuscripts. That is unheard of in the ancient world. That is without parallel in ancient documents. And so by comparing 10,000 manuscripts, you can deduce accuracy. Number 5, cross-checking with the Dead Sea manuscripts, which are 1,000 years earlier. And number 6, by comparison with other ancient books. So this is really good. And we have a picture for this too. By the comparison with other ancient books, as you can see here, you see the huge orange bar at the top? That is 10,000 Old Testament manuscripts. And look at how it compares with the other books. Homer is in second place with 643, and Demosthenes with 200. But everybody else pales in comparison. And so comparing them with other ancient books, the quotations and so forth, helps verify the accuracy. Miller Burroughs, he is an expert in manuscript research. He said this, quote, "It is a matter of wonder that through something like 1,000 years, the text underwent so little alteration. Herein lies its chief importance. It supports the fidelity of the Masoretic tradition." In other words, after discovering the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the book that he wrote on page 304, he is saying the Dead Sea Scrolls show us after 1,000 years, the Bible was unchanged. That's a long time. But we can trust the Old Testament manuscripts because they're unchanged. Gleason Archer, in his book, Old Testament Introduction on page 19, Gleason Archer said this, "Isaiah proved to be word for word identical with our standard Hebrew Bible in more than 95% of the text. And the 5% of variation consisted chiefly of obvious slips of the pen and variations of spelling." So the 5% of difference was merely tiny slips of the pen. No Bible doctrine, no Bible teaching, no major principle was in danger. That's what Gleason Archer says. More than 95% of the text, exactly the same. And F.F. Bruce, another great manuscript expert, he said this, "It may now be more confidently asserted than ever before that the Dead Sea discoveries have enabled us to answer this question of the reliability of the Old Testament text in the affirmative with much greater assurance than was possible before 1948. So the bottom line is, after 1,000 years, we see that the Old Testament manuscripts and documents are essentially unchanged, incredibly accurate, somewhere between 95 to 99%. Absolutely wonderful. How about the New Testament? So we've looked at the quantity and the quality of the Old Testament, and they are both extremely high. They are without comparison in the world of ancient documents. But what about the New Testament? After all, that's where the Gospels are, the life, ministry, death, resurrection of Jesus, and of course, Acts, the epistles, the letters, and Revelation. What about those? Well, in much the same way, let's look at the manuscripts in three different ways. These are three ways in which we can see, listen, the manuscripts of your New Testament Bible are superior to every other ancient book because of their quantity, how many there are, their immediacy, how early they are, the gap between the original and the copy, and number three, their quality, okay? Quantity, immediacy, and quality, okay? Let's jump into the quantity. The New Testament versus other ancient books. Most ancient books, as I told you, they have somewhere between 10 to 20 copies if you're lucky. Now, the interesting thing about that is you'll never be told that. If you go to Amazon, if you go to Barnes & Noble or Borders, or if you're studying some kind of an ancient book in the university, more than likely, the professor will never tell you that when you study Julius Caesar's book, The Gallic Wars, or Tacitus, one of the ancient Roman historians, his book called The Annals of History, they'll never tell you that the number of manuscript copies that we have for that is less than 20. They'll never tell you that. But they will trust that book. They will study that book. There are people that base their entire academic career on an ancient book that has 5 copies. As I said, Homer's Iliad, he's in second place. He has 643 manuscripts. Very, very good for the ancient world. But then, of course, we come to the New Testament. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm just proud to report it is the strongest Greek document, one of the strongest ancient documents in the world. 5,700 Greek manuscripts alone. Just in the Greek language, there is no other book in ancient history that has that many copies. But then if you add to the Greek manuscripts all of the other ones that are written in the Latin Vulgate, in the Syriac language, in Coptic, the number jumps up to 25,000 copies in total. That is absolutely mind-boggling. If you're a person who studies ancient documents, you're used to 5, 10, 20. How many for the New Testament? 25,000. That is absolutely phenomenal. Why? Well, because you can verify accuracy. That's a lot of different comparisons that you can make. So, the New Testament is far superior to any and every ancient book in terms of manuscripts because of quantity. Number two, let's talk about immediacy. How early, how immediate were the first copies made after the original writing took place? In other words, what is the gap of time? Because what we typically discover is that most other books, listen, there is a 1,000-year gap. In between when the original was written, there's 1,000 years until the first copy is made. Now let me ask you, can changes happen in 1,000 years? That's a long time. So you mean to tell me that, like Alexander the Great, there's two ancient sources for him, Plutarch and another gentleman. And you mean to tell me that if there's a 1,000-year gap with that kind of a writing, I'm supposed to believe it? I'm supposed to base my academic career as a Greek historian expert off of a manuscript with a 1,000-year gap between the first copy and the original writing? And you know what they would tell you? Yes. They would say, that's okay. It's Alexander the Great. But the New Testament is far superior in terms of its immediacy because the gap for the New Testament is 25 years in some cases. Now, you may think that's a long time. That is not a long time. In terms of ancient documents, that is less than an eye blink. The John Ryland manuscript, which we'll show you in a second, it was more than likely penned by a man who knew John himself, certainly who lived within his same generation. And that is unheard of in the ancient world. It happened right on top of the event. So again, it is without comparison in terms of how early, how immediately it was recorded. That is always the crucial thing with ancient documents. Manuscript expert Sir Frederick Kenyon, he said this: the interval between the dates of the original composition and the earliest extant evidence becomes so small as to be in fact negligible. And the last foundation for any doubt that the scriptures have come down substantially as they were, that doubt has now been removed. Both the authenticity and the general integrity of the books of the New Testament may be regarded as finally established. Absolutely wonderful. Let's show you some of the manuscripts that actually exist for the New Testament. This is the one that you saw. This is the earliest manuscript that we have, the John Ryland Papyrus, 5 verses from John 18 on the front and on the back. And it's dated about 117 AD, some would say 125, the John Ryland copy. And then also there's the Bodmer Papyri. This is from 200 AD. It contains most of John, 1st and 2nd Peter and Jude. Then we have the Chester Beatty manuscript. This is from 250 AD, and it contains nearly all of the New Testament books. And then we also have the Codex Vaticanus. This is dated from 325 to 350 AD, and it contains most of the Old Testament and New Testament. Those are just some of the examples of the New Testament manuscripts we have. Now, the Dean of Archaeology, a PhD man, he is a scholar in terms of archaeology and manuscripts, W.F. Albright, he said this: in my opinion, every book of the New Testament was written by a baptized Jew between the 40s and the 80s of the 1st century A.D. In other words, W.F. Albright is going on record in claiming the immediacy and the early date of the New Testament manuscripts. And William Craig, he says there is no time for myths to develop in the New Testament manuscripts. He says this: the writings of the Greek historian Herodotus enable us to test the rate at which a legend accumulates. The tests show that even the span of 2 generations is too short to allow legendary tendencies to wipe out the hardcore of historical fact. Did you hear that? 2 generations, which would be about 80 years, that is not even enough time for legend and myth to creep in and wipe out the historical truth. And we don't have to even worry about that because the New Testament manuscripts are written, in some cases, 25 years after the occurrence of the event. So after talking about their quantity, 25,000, their immediacy, between 25 to 100 years of the time of the original, let's now talk about their quality. What is the quality of the New Testament manuscripts? Are they good? Can you trust them? Well, a couple of aspects of their quality. First of all, they're accurate. The accuracy of the New Testament is amazing. Even the atheist Bart Ehrman admits this. He said in his book, Misquoting Jesus, on page 55, keep in mind here, he is an atheist New Testament scholar. Yes, they exist. Talk about intellectual schizophrenia, huh? Atheist New Testament scholar. He says, in fact, most of the changes found in the early Christian manuscripts have nothing to do with theology or ideology. So if you ever hear something that says there are hundreds of mistakes in the manuscripts, you know what they actually mean? There are hundreds of slips of the pen, or a misspelled E, or a misspelled S. But wait a second, does that invalidate the truth of the Bible? Does that contradict any teaching or doctrine? Absolutely not. So atheists, they will take information and they will twist it. Bart Ehrman here himself, he admits that changes have nothing to do with ideology or theology or doctrine. Westcott and Hort, they estimate that about 1/60th of the changes rise above trivialities. So they say that the New Testament manuscripts are 98.33% pure. Ezra Abbott, he says that the New Testament text is 99.75% pure. A.T. Robertson, he says it is 99.9% pure. You know what that means? That means that between all the different scholars that exist, listen, the New Testament accuracy is somewhere between 98.33 and 99.9% accurate from the original. And that means it has a higher accuracy than any other book of the ancient world. So can you trust your New Testament? Absolutely. So it has great accuracy. Number two, it has great proximity. In other words, the people that wrote it down, they were very close to the events they were writing about. For example, the writers of the New Testament, they based their work on eyewitness testimony. Let me read you some verses to make this clear to you. John 19:35. The man who saw it has given testimony, and his testimony is true. John 21:24. This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. In Acts chapter 2, it says, God has raised this Jesus to life, and we are all witnesses of this fact. Acts chapter 4, Peter said, we cannot help speaking about what we have seen and heard. So all through the book of Acts and all through the epistles, historical scholars can tell, so could any Bible reader, that the people that are writing these, they claim to have been eyewitnesses, and you can see indicators in the text that they actually did see what they were writing about. There are numerous PhD scholars that claim that the New Testament is based on eyewitness testimony. 15, let me just read you their names. Richard Bauckham, Craig Blomberg, F.F. Bruce, D.A. Carson, William Lane Craig, C.H. Dodd, Donald Guthrie, Gary Habermas, Frederick Kenyon, Bruce Metzger, N.T. Wright, and many, many others. So it does come from eyewitness testimony. We can be sure of that. Number three, another aspect of its quality, not just the accuracy and the proximity, but number three, the authenticity of the New Testament. You know, when scholars look at an ancient book, what they try to do is they try to figure out whether the people that wrote it are lying. They try to figure out whether the people that wrote it are exaggerating. For example, if you read the writings about Buddha, what you will discover is that when Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, he's an Indian prince from about 500 BC, he popped out of his mommy's womb, and right away, he started speaking. There was no crying in childbirth, nothing like that at all. He just popped out, and he started teaching people. Does that sound realistic? Not really. Not really. If you read the Quran, it says that Muhammad was translated to heaven by a horse that had wings with the face of a woman. That's pretty strange. So the nature of the New Testament writing, in contrast to all of that, is very, very different. There is a high degree of authenticity. It is extremely authentic, and here's how even atheists know this to be true. Listen to this. As you read the New Testament writings, here's what we discover. The writers of the New Testament made no attempt to harmonize their accounts. because there are slight differences. They included material that put Jesus in a bad light. In some places, they left many difficult passages in their text. The writings of the New Testament have many self-incriminating details. They talk bad about themselves, which shows honesty. The New Testament writings include many demanding sayings of Jesus. The writers distinguished their words from Jesus' words. These writers did not deny their testimony under the threat of death. They held that this was true. They claimed their record was based on eyewitness testimony. In the writings of the New Testament, they had women witnessing the resurrection before men. Now, do you know why that's significant? Because in the early first century, in Jewish culture, women couldn't even testify at trial because their testimony was less reliable than that of a thief. That's what they said back then. I'm not saying that, ladies. That's what they said back then. So the fact that the apostles knew that, the disciples knew that, and they wrote it down anyway, that the women were the first witnesses, it goes to show, wow, man, they really shouldn't have written that. I guess they must be telling the truth. While they made themselves look stupid, wow, they must be telling the truth. Wow, they distinguished their words from Jesus. They put Jesus in a bad light. Wow, these guys kind of should have changed this stuff, but they left it alone, and those are what we call hallmarks of authenticity. They also challenged readers to check out the facts for themselves. In the New Testament, they discarded long-held Jewish beliefs overnight, like going to the temple, animal sacrifice, and so forth. And in the New Testament writings, they include more than 30 historical people. So the authenticity of the New Testament documents is in a category high and above by itself. And finally, the unity of the New Testament. Something that tells us the quality of the manuscripts, which is not just their quantity, their proximity, their authenticity. Fourthly, listen, is the unity of the New Testament. Most of you may not be aware that most ancient books have only one or two writers. And so the unity of that book, well, it makes sense that there's unity because only one guy wrote the book. He's probably not going to contradict himself, right? Most ancient books, the biographies of Alexander or the writings of Tacitus, they have one or two authors. However, listen, the New Testament has 9 different authors, 27 different books of the New Testament. So you tell me, is there a high probability they could contradict each other? Is there a high probability that they could write down teachings or write down sayings that could conflict? And guess what? It never, ever happens. Though there are 9 different authors and 27 different books, they all agree in their teaching and in their doctrine. The New Testament writers, the 9 of them, are Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Paul, Peter, James, Jude, and the mysterious author of Hebrews. I think it's Apollos, but that's just my personal opinion. But there are 9 writers. These guys are always consistent and unified in their testimony, even though they wrote about dozens of different doctrines and teachings. Amidst their diversity, they express an incredible unity in their writings. And that's it, ladies and gentlemen. That is, in a nutshell, the evidence for the manuscripts of the Bible. The Old Testament manuscripts excel every other ancient document in the world because of their quantity and because of their quality. And the New Testament documents, they excel every ancient document because of their quantity, their immediacy, and because of their quality. So listen, what you can do, I often do this. When I have my Bible in my hand, I just look at the pages and I reflect upon the great foundation that is in this book and that it's trustworthy and that I can rely upon it. And you know what I do sometimes? I just go, Lord, thank you for the Bible. I can trust this book because the manuscript evidence is so strong. So you don't need to doubt the transmission accuracy. This book has been more reliably copied than any other book in the ancient world. And next, we're going to take a short break. Next, we're going to get into the archaeology and the history of the Bible. And we are going to give you a rapid-fire slideshow of the amazing archaeological discoveries of the Old Testament and the New Testament. And you're going to see it is founded and rooted in great history.